You know that feeling, right? That frustration when there is a huge problem in your community, something you know is incredibly important, and it just gets ignored? Well, today we're going to dive into a really powerful framework that's designed to turn that frustration into focused, effective action. It's called the Real Capital Framework, and it's basically a playbook for making real change.
It is so maddening. You see scientists sounding the alarm about something critical. But by the time that message gets to the people who can actually do something about it, it feels like it's been totally lost in translation. So why does that keep happening?
Well, a big part of it is something called the expert filter problem. You can think of it like a game of telephone, where a clear, urgent message just gets weaker and more distorted with every person it passes through. Let's walk through how this works. Okay, so it starts with scientists, right? They state a simple physical fact, like this ecosystem is about to collapse. But then it goes to business experts and economists who immediately translate it into financial terms. They're asking, okay, but what's the cost of fixing this versus the profit from the industry causing the problem? And then, finally, it gets to political advisors who reframe it again, this time asking, what will voters think about this? Is this politically survivable? And the results of all that filtering? A terrifying warning about an ecological tipping point just becomes a boring debate about quarterly earnings and poll numbers. And what does that lead to? Usually, nothing. Just paralysis. The original urgency is just gone. So how on earth do we fix this?
The whole idea here is that we need to change the lens we're using. We need a new way of thinking. And that's where the Real Capital Framework comes in. It's a way to cut right through all that noise from the expert filters.
So what even is real capital? Well, think of it as the foundational assets that our society absolutely depends on to function. These aren't just things we use up and throw away. We're talking about the systems that actually sustain us, like a forest that gives us timber, yeah, but also cleans our air and water, or the social trust that holds our communities together. And here is the absolute key shift in thinking. Traditional economics, it's obsessed with flows. Short-term things like GDP, quarterly profits, income. The real capital view says, hang on, let's focus on the health of our stocks, the long-term condition of our actual assets. Are our ecosystems healthy? Is our infrastructure actually working? Is our community trust strong? It's a totally different set of questions. And this is why it's so incredibly powerful. It starts using language that policymakers and business leaders literally cannot ignore. Instead of making a purely moral argument, you're framing the issue in terms of risk management. You're asking, are we draining our natural assets so much that we're heading for environmental insolvency? Suddenly, you've reframed the destruction of a forest as a massive liability on a balance sheet. And that is much, much harder to dismiss. Now, this isn't just some big, abstract idea. This way of thinking has actually been turned into a very concrete 12-step playbook for advocacy. The full playbook has all 12 steps, but they really boil down to these 3 crucial phases. First up is diagnosis. You get crystal clear on exactly what asset is being threatened and why it matters. Second is strategy. You figure out who's responsible and, more importantly, where the real leverage point is to force a change. And finally, action. You create a specific, undeniable demand. This is what moves a campaign from just being angry to being truly strategic. Okay, that all sounds great in theory, but you're probably wondering, does it actually work in the real world? Well, let's take a look at a case study where this playbook was put to the test, the biodiversity crisis in Sweden's forests. So the first step, diagnosis, started with documenting the real state of this capital asset, the forests. And what they found was pretty shocking. In Sweden, only 5% of its productive forest is that rich, old-growth ecosystem that nature really needs to thrive. Just 5%. Okay, so that's where things are. But where should they be? Well, according to the scientific consensus and official EU policy, at least 20 to 30% of the forest area needs to be protected and restored. And right there, that difference between the 5% reality and the 30% goal, that creates what the framework calls the normative gap. This isn't someone's opinion. It's an irrefutable, data-driven space between what is and what everyone has already agreed should be. And that gap, that's the strategic core of the entire campaign. I mean, look at this. The gap becomes impossible to ignore when you put the data right next to their own goals. On one side, you have the documented reality, only 5% old-growth forest, biodiversity in continuous decline. And on the other side,
You have Sweden's own official environmental goals with nice names like living forests. It just lays bare the failure to live up to their own promises. So once you have that gap clearly defined, you can finally move past just general complaining and start to build a really powerful, targeted ask for specific action.
What the framework does next is it forces you to name names. Who are the material actors actually responsible for this gap? See, it's not some vague force like the economy. No, it's specific forestry corporations, it's specific agribusiness supply chains, and the specific financial institutions that are bankrolling the whole thing. And just like that, you have a target. All of that deep research and strategy then gets boiled down into clear, powerful materials, like this flyer. Notice it doesn't just say save the forests. It points to the specific data-driven gap, 5% versus 30%, and it calls on specific government agencies to do their jobs. It's simple, it's visual, and it's basically impossible to misunderstand. So by the end of this whole process, you're not just another angry voice in the crowd. You have a strategic, data-driven ask that holds specific people accountable for closing a very clearly defined gap. And that puts you in a fundamentally more powerful position. And really, that's what this is all about. The Real Capital Framework gives you a structured method for channeling that righteous anger we all feel into disciplined, strategic, and, most importantly, effective action. This quote from the case study just says it all, doesn't it? We're not talking about preserving pretty scenery here. We are talking about maintaining the foundational living systems, the real capital, that allow our entire society to function and to thrive in the first place. So I'll just leave you with this final thought. This isn't just about some forests in Sweden. I want you to look around your own town, your own community. What's the gap between what's been promised and what's actually being delivered? Because with a framework like this, you now have a playbook to help you close it.